25 men went north in 1881. 7 were found alive in 1884. 6 came home. The missing number is usually explained by the Arctic, but the calendar tells a harder story. A relief ship was supposed to return after 1 year. It did not reach the station. A second relief ship was supposed to reach them the next summer. It was crushed in the ice. A third relief force arrived at Cape Sabine on 20 Surenga, June 1884, and found men who had been waiting through the wrong number of winters. The villain of this story is not ice. It is a calendar. Before this is over, Greely will order one of his own men shot, but that order was not the beginning of the disaster. It was what the disaster produced. The question is not whether the Lady Franklin Bay expedition suffered in the Arctic. The records answer that plainly. The question is why the United States sent 25 men into a place where survival depended on 1 ship per summer, and then gave the system no durable answer for 2 missed summers in a row. The expedition began as science. In 1879, an international polar program called for observation stations around the Arctic. The United States agreed to establish 2, one at Point Barrow, Alaska, and one at Lady Franklin Bay, on the northeast coast of Ellesmere Island. The War Department placed the northern station under the Army Signal Service. First Lieutenant Adolphus W. Greely was sent to keep observations: weather, tides, magnetism, animal life, landforms, and the other data the international program required. That matters because the expedition was planned as a station, not as a shipboard polar campaign. The ship was transportation. The station was the mission. The assumption was already there in 1881. On 7th July 1881, the sealing steamer Proteus left St. John's, Newfoundland. George Rice, the expedition photographer, wrote that the party was being sent under the auspices of the War Department for scientific observation in Arctic regions. The plan, as he recorded it, was to establish a station at Lady Franklin Bay and spend 2 years there. The roster reached 25. It included Greely, Lieutenant James Lockwood, Lieutenant Frederick Kislingberry, astronomers, meteorological observers, enlisted men, and 2 Inuit dog drivers recruited in Greenland, Jens Edward and Thorlip Frederick Christensen. Their names survive mainly in the American and British records. Their own account of the expedition does not survive in the sources I can use here, and that absence matters. The European record tells us they were essential to the sledge work. It rarely lets them speak. The Proteus made the 1881 voyage with unusual ease. That ease was the first warning, though no one could yet read it that way. Later accounts would point out that the summer was unusually open. In 1881, the ship crossed waters that had stopped earlier polar vessels. It reached Lady Franklin Bay on 11 August, unloaded men and stores, and left the party at Fort Conger later that month. On the map, the weakness is visible before the dying begins. Fort Conger sits high in Lady Franklin Bay. Cape Sabine and Littleton Island sit far to the south, along the route a relief ship might reach if it could not force the ice farther north. After the Proteus disappeared south, the plan was simple enough to write on a calendar. Summer 1882, a ship returns with supplies. Summer 1883, a ship returns again and brings the party home. The fatal assumption was that 1 relief opportunity per summer was enough. In plain terms, the plan treated a missed ship as a delay, not as the first half of a compound failure. It assumed that the next summer would repair the previous summer. It did not put a second capable ship in the same season. It did not keep a vessel with Greely's party. It did not build a relief chain strong enough to survive 2 failures. The plan was not absurd on paper. The station had supplies. The men had shelter. They had scientific work. They had game in some seasons and sledge parties in others. But paper is patient in a way ice is not. The first year at Fort Conger was orderly enough to hide the weakness. The men built their house. They made observations. They celebrated holidays. In March 1882, the light returned. Greely sent sledging parties north and inland. Pavey, Rice, and Jens reached Cape Joseph Henry and turned back when the pack ice made further travel impractical. Lockwood, Brainerd, and Christensen went farther north than any recorded party before them, reaching 83 degrees 23 minutes north in May. That achievement became the success the expedition could show the world. But the relief calendar had already begun moving toward its own test. In July 1882, Greely's men expected the resupply ship. Rice's records from 1881 had imagined a 2-year station. The public timeline preserved by PBS notes that a resupply ship was scheduled to return after 1 year, and that the party planned to return to the United States in September 1883. The ship sent in 1882 was Neptune. Neptune left St. John's on 8th of July with provisions. It was late in a short season. When it reached Kennedy Channel, ice stopped the last leg toward Lady Franklin Bay. The ship did not reach Fort Conger. It left supplies far to the south around Cape Sabine and Littleton Island, hundreds of miles from the station. At Fort Conger, the first missed arrival was not yet a disaster. The party still had stores. The station still functioned. The men continued observations through the winter of 1882 and 1883. That is why the first failure is easy to understate. It did not kill anyone at once. It simply changed the problem from living at a station to trusting a calendar that had already failed once. The first failure did not look like a disaster. That was the danger. The 1883 relief attempt carried the weight of everything the 1882 ship had not done. By late 1882 and early 1883, the War Department and the Signal Service knew the next summer mattered. General William B. Hazen, Chief Signal Officer, formulated the plan for the 1883 expedition. A later Navy account records that Hazen was advised to seek naval help for the relief party and that he rejected full Navy control as hazardous to the continuity of the work. The Army kept the main control. Lieutenant Ernest Garlington was ordered to command the 1883 relief expedition. The Proteus was chartered again. A second vessel, the Navy's Yantic, was assigned as escort, but its orders limited its freedom. Yantic was not suited for ice navigation and was not to enter the pack in a way that endangered her return. That arrangement looked like reinforcement. In practice, it meant the only real ice ship was still Proteus. The second failure was different. It did not only miss the station, it destroyed the depot plan. The decision that changed everything was not made in a tent at Camp Clay. It was made before the 1883 relief force left the United States. The rescue plan again made one advanced ship carry the practical burden of reaching Greely. When Proteus met the ice near Cape Sabine in July 1883, that burden became visible. The ship was trapped, crushed, and lost. Most of the provisions went down with her or were lost on the ice. A small cache was left near Cape Sabine. Garlington and the ship's company escaped south in boats. Yantic did not become the second rescue ship the plan needed. Its orders, design, and distance made that impossible. The official record after the failure is blunt in its implication. Yantic eventually returned without reaching Greely or leaving an adequate store for him. The 1883 expedition had not only failed to bring the men home, it had failed to create the depot their instructions told them to expect. At Fort Conger, Greely did not know all of that. He knew the ship had not come. His orders had told him what to do if no relief reached the station for 2 successive years. He was to move south toward the depots. The logic was cruel but clear. If the ships could not reach Fort Conger, Greely was to move toward the ships. So in August 1883, after 2 missed summers, Greely abandoned Fort Conger. This is where the case changes shape. Until this moment, a viewer can follow the story as a stranded expedition waiting for rescue. After this moment, the better question is different. Had the relief plan created a place in the South that could sustain the men it ordered south? The answer was no. Greely's party moved by boat, steam launch, and ice. They left behind weight to make the retreat possible. That included supplies, which would have mattered if the expected depot was not real. The move south was not a reckless wander. It was the authorized contingency. The map now matters more than the weather. Fort Conger was behind them. Cape Sabine was ahead. The plan had told them the food would be there. An authorized contingency can still be lethal if the object it points toward does not exist. The men drifted, struggled, and landed near Eskimo Point in late September. In October, they reached Cape Sabine. They expected a serious depot. They found a small cache, a note about the wreck of Proteus, and the arithmetic of a failed plan. From here, the case moves into Camp Clay, where hunger began to write the rules. Schlee's 1884 report gives the number that matters. The latest letters found by the rescue search indicated Greely had only 40 days' rations and was wintering near the cache left from the wrecked Proteus. 40 days of rations for a party that would have to last through an Arctic winter is not a depot. It is a receipt for a failure that had already happened. Greely named the winter camp Camp Clay. The camp was on Cape Sabine near Smith Sound. It had little shelter. It had the remnants of British caches, the small store left by Garlington's failed relief expedition, whatever could be hunted or netted, and the ration discipline Greely could impose on men who were now living inside a mathematical trap. By January 1884, the trap had become physical. The first man died on 18th of January. Others followed. The records list starvation, drowning, exhaustion, and disease around the final winter. Schlee's relief report later recorded that Greely and Brainerd told him 17 men had perished by starvation, and one had drowned while out sealing. Numbers can flatten a death list. The camp did not experience them as a list. A ration became smaller. A man stayed in his sleeping bag. The shrimp nets mattered. Candle wax, leather, and whatever else could be swallowed became part of the inventory. The horizon mattered every day because the horizon was the only place a ship could appear. The relief ship calendar returned with a new layer. 1882 failed to reach Fort Conger. 1883, Proteus crushed, depot not made. 1884, no ship yet, and the men at Camp Clay were dying inside the consequence of the first two entries. By April, David Brainerd's Camp Clay diary was no longer recording an expedition. It was recording a mind trying to stay intact. On 23rd April, he wrote that this life was getting almost unbearable and that he feared they would all go mad. That sentence is not a theatrical line. It is what a supply plan sounds like after it enters the tent. Henry enters the story here, but he should not be made the center of it. Private Charles B. Henry had a documented record before the expedition and a reputation inside it as strong, skilled, and difficult. Modern archival work reconstructs his background from military records and notes that pages believed to be his survived for parts of the final winter. That matters because Henry was not an anonymous symbol. He was a man in the record, and the record around him is complicated. At Camp Clay, Henry was repeatedly accused of stealing food. In a starving camp, theft was not only a disciplinary problem, it was a survival threat. If one man took more, another man might die sooner. Greely issued a warning that the next theft would be punished by death. On the 6th of June 1884, Henry was shot at Camp Clay. Not in May, as some later retellings have suggested. The date matters because it places the execution deep inside the final starvation period. The execution was real. The exact moral shape of it is harder. What we know is that Greely ordered it, that Henry had been accused of stealing food, and that the camp was in late starvation. What we do not know from the surviving contemporary record is every private calculation made by the men who carried out the order. Later accounts differ on details. The responsible line is not to turn the execution into a simple character verdict. It was an act produced by a camp whose rules had been narrowed by hunger. That is the cruelest part of the case. The relief plan did not merely fail to save the men, it changed the social facts inside the camp. It made ration theft into a capital matter. It made discipline and survival nearly indistinguishable. On 22nd June 1884, the ships finally came. The rescue count was not a victory. It was the measure of what was left. By then, the rescue system looked very different from the 1882 and 1883 attempts. The 1884 board had recommended 2 relief vessels in government control. The Royal Geographical Society advisors consulted by the United States said the main relief party should consist of 2 ships, one to advance in the actual search, one to serve as a depot ship in case the first was lost. The board also recommended early departure. The Navy's 1884 force included Bear, Thetis, Alert, and the collier Loch Garry. It had 2 capable ships in the search and a coal support plan behind them. It had learned too late the lesson the first plan should have built in. Schlee's report records the sequence at Cape Sabine. Search parties found records indicating Greely was nearby. Lieutenant Colwell took Bear's steam launch toward the cache site. He saw a man on the rocks, then another. One came down slowly and fell near the boat. He said there were 7 alive in the tent over the hill. That sentence is the last confirmed point for the survival threat of this episode. 7 alive in the tent. Caldwell reached them. The camp was half blown down. The survivors were at the edge of death. Schlee's report says the only food left was boiled leather and uncooked leather. The dead were in shallow graves or on the ice foot. Records, instruments, clothing, and relics were gathered and taken aboard. 7 men were found alive. Joseph Ellison died after the rescue, leaving 6 survivors of the original 25. This is where the popular story usually changes subjects. The rescue ships brought back men, records, bodies, and rumors. In August 1884, American newspapers turned the story toward cannibalism and murder. The New York Times coverage became part of that press storm. Other papers repeated and amplified it. The most famous image of the Greely expedition became the starving survivors and the bodies brought home. The records require a colder order of explanation. Cause first, act second. Starvation came from a collapsed supply chain. The collapsed supply chain came from failed relief. The failed relief came from a plan that did not survive compound failure. Only after that chain is clear can the forensic evidence be handled honestly. Schlee's report says that when the bodies were prepared for transport, 6 of them showed cuts and removed flesh. Dartmouth's Brainerd Diary introduction notes that the body cutting was evident, but says the returned diaries do not establish when cannibalism began. Greely, in later comments preserved in PBS's journal selection, said the news was horrible to him and that if it happened without his knowledge and against discipline. Then the public story changed. The legend says the Greely story is the cannibalism story. The records say the cannibalism evidence belongs near the end of a relief failure, not at the beginning of the case. The forensic record shows bodies had been cut. The diaries do not give a clean sequence for when or by whom. The sensationalist press made the act the headline. The relief calendar made the conditions. The scandal was what the public could see. The system failure was what the records had to reconstruct. This does not excuse the act. It places it where the evidence places it, inside starvation produced by a failed system. The inquiry and later record did not punish the calendar. The public could understand a man shot at Camp Clay. It could understand bodies returned in alcohol tanks. It could understand a scandal. What it had more trouble holding in view was the administrative shape of the disaster. One summer, one ship, one failure treated as repairable by the next summer, then a second failure that left the men at a camp built on expectation rather than supplies. Even in 1886, serious observers could see the mechanism. Nature called the lack of a real naval role a mistake, and the failure to give Greely's party an escape ship an even more fatal blunder. It also blamed blundering and half-heartedness at home for the sacrifice of life. The competing explanations are not all false. Ice mattered. The 1882 ship met ice. Proteus was crushed in 1883. The retreat from Fort Conger was dangerous because the sea and coast were dangerous. Camp Clay was a brutal place to winter. Greely's decisions mattered too. He left Fort Conger according to his instructions, but that does not mean every choice at Camp Clay was beyond scrutiny. The execution of Henry remains one of the hardest acts in American expedition history. The ration discipline, the conflict with Pavie, and the internal authority of the camp all belong in the case. But if the question is what produced the death toll, the record keeps returning to the relief plan. The men did not die because the Arctic was unknown. The danger was known well enough for the 1884 advisors to recommend 2 ships, 2-year provisions, sledging equipment, and a depot ship. They died because the effective version of that thinking arrived after the second failure, not before the first. The relief plan was rated for a normal correction. It was not rated for a chain. The colder verdict is this: the Greely disaster was not created by the ice alone. It was created by a relief system that treated each summer as if it could repair the last one, until there were no summers left for the men at Camp Clay. The survivors could be honored. The scandal could be sold. The scientific records could be praised, but none of that changed the calendar. 1882, the ship did not reach them. 1883, the ship was crushed. 1884, Bear arrived to find 7 men alive and a camp the plan had already abandoned. The Greely disaster did not begin on the morning Henry was shot. It began in Washington in 1881 when a station was placed beyond ordinary rescue, and the relief plan was allowed to depend on every summer doing the work of two. The Arctic took the bodies. The calendar took the margin.